Representing the pro side, Dr. Christopher Fairley, who is a clinical researcher and the director of the Melbourne Sexual Health Center. His principal research interest is in the control of sexually transmitted infections. Representing the con, Dr. Harold Chesson, who is a health economist in the Division of STD Prevention at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. His research focuses on the impact and cost effectiveness of STD prevention programs and policies. Dr. Fairley.
Okay. So thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to come and make the case that gonorrhea transmission is common through kissing. Let me start by thanking the organisers, also Joe, Jamie, Sevki, and particularly Harold for being such a delightful and impressive speaker. I'm just sorry I can't be there to have dinner with you tonight, but never mind, we'll see how we go. So I have a favour to ask though, before you start thinking about this. I want you to wipe the slate clean. And that's really important because people find it hard to change their mind. We resist new ideas. The earth was flat until it was round. There was no global warming until there was. And kissing didn't transmit gonorrhea until perhaps it did. Now the Bible, the book we all respect enormously, says that gonorrhea infection is transmitted to the pharynx by orogenital sexual contact. There's no mention of kissing. So the arguments I'm going to make today are that there's very little evidence at all about kissing, for or against. I'm then going to say that gonorrhea is much more common than is previously thought. It is simply not possible for the penis to transmit the infection to the throat. And therefore, I'm going to come to the conclusion, on the best available knowledge at the moment, is the only rational conclusion is that kissing transmits the infection. Just remember, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So as I'm speaking, I want you to ask yourself, what evidence is there that kissing does not transmit gonorrhea? Do studies include kissing as an exposure when they're looking at throat gonorrhea? So I did a simple Medline search. I did gonorrhea and kissing. The terms I used are below. I came up with 6 articles published on gonorrhea and kissing. I did gonorrhea and sex and found 1,400 papers. Now this doesn't include all the papers because you've got to look at the references of other journals. But the point I'm trying to make is there's very little evidence about that. I then looked at the 6 papers, and 5 were authored by our group in Melbourne and 1 was an editorial on those. So there were no other papers that I could find, although I am aware of ones back in the 1970s and 80s. The problem is that no one asks about kissing. National sexual surveys in the UK, in Australia and the US don't ask about kissing. Even the French, you think they would ask about kissing, but they don't even ask about kissing either. So the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We've got to start this thinking at that level. The next point I want to make is that throat gonorrhea is really common. So this is a graph of 3 studies. 2 of them, the one in green and the one in blue, sampled every week gay men looking for the incidence of throat gonorrhea. And the study in red is a PrEP study, which is sampled every 3 months and looked at the incidence of urethral pharyngeal gonorrhea, and then there's the number of partners. So if you use the red study as a sort of comparison when you sample every 3 months. Now, if you sample weekly, as Eric Chow did there in the green study, you'll find a urethral incidence of 8, a pharyngeal incidence of nearly 60 per 100 person years, and the number of partners in that study was about 20, similar to the PrEP study. And you look at Lindley Barbie's study, both of these papers are under review at the moment. She found a pharyngeal incidence of about 35. So if you don't sample every week, you miss it. So not only is it actually very common if you sample 3 monthly, but it's even more common if you sample every week because some of it is short-lived. So given that high incidence, how can we explain this? Given there is an absence of evidence that it doesn't cause, that kissing does not cause transmission. So ask the question, how did it get there? How did it get into the throat? Well, if a man has sex with another man, the probability that that other person has gonorrhea in the throat is about 10%. In the penis is about 0.4%, because even though the incidence is reasonable, it's treated very quickly, in most cases asymptomatic. And the anus is about 10%. So it can only come from one of those three sites. Now, how might it get there? Well, these are the connections between them. The infected man on the left, the man on the right, in whom we've got to generate an incidence of 20% in the throat, 7%, sorry, excuse me, this is the number of contact, 20 kissing partners, 7 oral sex partners, and 2.5 rimming partners in the throat of the man on the right-hand side. So how do we put all this together, the proportion of contacts that are infected at each site and the contact between those sites? Well, we might first try and blame the penis. It most certainly wants to get into those sites as often as it possibly can. So if we use the penile hypothesis, remember, there's not supposed to be transmission through kissing. The Bible said it comes from the penis, and so the infected man on the left, 10% in the throat, 0.4% in the penis, 10% in the bottom, he has to generate an incidence of 20% over here in the susceptible man. Well, to do that, with that number of contacts and that proportion of people positive, you're going to need about 100 sexual partners to do that. What about if we say that transmission could occur through kissing? Well, there are 20 contacts between males in a given year. If you look at the percentage positive on the left-hand side, it's running at about 10%. This is still 0.4%. So you can easily generate this sort of incidence if you invoke kissing as a possible source of transmission. So which of these hypotheses pass? Well, the penis, no matter how hard it works, cannot explain the epidemiology, but the oropharynx can. So the only conclusion is that kissing must have transmitted a sizable proportion of those infections. Is there other evidence? Well, there is a building amount of other evidence. This is a outbreak of infection where lots of throats were infected, no genitals were infected, published in Emerging Infectious Diseases, all the same genotype. How could it get there any other way? The genitals weren't infected. There's partner studies of gay men where genital infection didn't occur at all, but you've got concordance between the men, genetically identical gonorrhea types of about 26%. So to summarise the issue, I want you to clear your head and think openly about this. There is very little evidence against transmission between the throat because nobody measures that exposure. The penis can't explain the epidemiology. The incidence is too high in the throat for the penis to be responsible for it. There's an absence of data on kissing. There's outbreak investigation, partner studies, and other work that's developing. So the penis cannot be the only guilty one. The throat and penis are partners in crime in transmitting this infection between throats. There is no other rational conclusion than kissing must commonly transmit gonorrhea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Today I'll be arguing against the motion that gonorrhea transmission through kissing is common. I would like to thank my opponent, Kit Fairley, in this debate, and I encourage everyone to read this article in Lancet Infectious Diseases about his distinguished career. I'm sure the question everyone is asking is, why send an economist to debate a world-renowned infectious disease expert on the topic of gonorrhea transmission through kissing? I mean, do we have any evidence that anyone has ever actually kissed an economist? No, in fact, we don't. But what economists bring to the table is that economists are people who are good at math, but lack the personality to become accountants. And math is critical to this debate. There's only been a very few studies that suggest that gonorrhea transmission through kissing might be common. And I think we need to rethink the math in these studies. These are four of the main arguments that Kit's group has made over the last few years. And I want to go through each of these briefly, starting with site-specific infections in partner studies. One of the main studies focused on 60 MSM couples in which at least one man tested positive for gonorrhea. There were 48 couples in which neither man had urethral infection, but at least one man had throat gonorrhea. And of those couples, in 23% of them, both men had throat gonorrhea. And this 23%, the authors say, is substantially higher than would be expected to occur by chance, given overall gonorrhea positivity. I say, of course, it's higher than would be expected to occur by chance because the study of 60 couples excluded the couples without gonorrhea. So let's rethink the math in this. This is the prevalence of throat gonorrhea in those 120 MSM. It was over 50% overall. But in MSM with partners who had throat gonorrhea, it was 40% versus about 65% in MSM whose partners did not have throat gonorrhea. So if gonorrhea transmission through kissing were common, we would expect that having a partner with throat gonorrhea would put one at higher risk for throat gonorrhea, not lower risk. This is presented as evidence for this new paradigm of gonorrhea transmission, but I think when we rethink the math, this study actually provides strong evidence against gonorrhea transmission through kissing. Now, is saliva use as a lubricant for anal sex as a risk factor for gonorrhea? Before getting into this, I want to talk about turbulence injuries on a hypothetical flight, STI Airlines 2020. Imagine that there's 200 people on this flight and half are wearing seat belts and half are not. And among those wearing seat belts, there's one turbulence injury, and among those not wearing seat belts, there are 25 injuries. Now, we could do the standard EPI calculations and show that not wearing seat belts is associated with an increased risk of turbulence injury. But what if someone were to tell you, you know, the analysis should include not only those on the plane, but also those who are on the ground, because technically they were not wearing seat belts on that flight either. Now, if you included the 0 injuries out of the 7.8 billion people who were not on the flight, that would really skew the analysis, and you would find that not wearing seat belts on Flight 2020 was associated with a decreased risk of turbulence injury. But we would say, you know, that's not the right way to do it. Your study should include only those who are on the flight. So here's where the study of saliva use as a lubricant for anal sex as a risk factor for gonorrhea comes into play. I think if you're going to do this study, you should only include those who are on the flight, that is, those who are having receptive anal sex. You should exclude those who are not having receptive anal sex and those who do not have recent male sex partners. And this study, however, did include men who had no receptive anal sex, as shown in the red, and those who had no recent male sex partners, as shown in blue. So I think we need to rethink the math on this. The study found that saliva use was barely significant at traditional levels when these men were included. So I think when you exclude them, as perhaps you should, then the study would have come to entirely different conclusions. And in fact, there was another study of MSM in Germany who excluded MSM without recent sex partners. And that study found that using saliva as a lubricant was not associated with rectal infection. And now for the hypothesis that you need 100 partners a year for penile to throat transmission. Kit made this assertion at the 2019 ISS-TDR debate, and the basic argument is similar to what he gave earlier. You know, you need 100 partners a year to have a 50% chance of encountering an infectious penis. And this is assuming about 1 in 200 men at any given time have urethral infection. Now let's suppose that only 1 in 200 MSM have an infected penis at any given time. These would be expected to be divided into low risk and high risk MSM, just for example here, 180 and 20. Let's say the low risk MSM have 2 partners a year and the high risk MSM have 50 partners a year. In this example, the high risk MSM account for about 10% of the population, but for about 74% of the casual partners. So Kit's math says to have a 50% chance of encountering the infected penis, one must have 90 partners. And if those 90 partners were chosen randomly from the population, you'd get 90 low risk and 10 high risk. So I say here's where we have to rethink the math in these calculations. Most partners would be high risk, not low risk, as I showed earlier. If everybody were having lots of sex with low risk partners, there wouldn't be any low risk partners. More importantly, high-risk MSM are more likely to be infected than low-risk MSM. If that one infection is in the 20 high-risk men, that's a prevalence of about 5%. So you would only need about 10 high-risk partners to encounter the infected penis. And now to the idea that gonorrhea prevalence cannot be explained without kissing. This was a model Kit's group published that said that kissing accounts for 72% of gonorrhea in MSM. What I want to point out before showing the equation in that model is just that MSM can acquire gonorrhea more than once per year. Consider a very high-risk group of MSM, such that on average, each man in this group is infected every 3 months. If you're infected on average every 3 months, that corresponds to an annual rate of infection of about 4 per year. The key here is that your annual rate of infection can exceed 1, whereas your annual probability of infection cannot exceed 1. Now, in their model, in all models, the force of infection is the rate at which the susceptible group becomes infected. In their particular model, it seems as if they treat this force of infection as a probability, which cannot exceed 1, instead of a rate, which should be allowed to exceed 1 for the highest risk MSM. And the model also seems to be capped by gonorrhea prevalence in the population. For example, if prevalence in the population is 10%, one's annual probability of gonorrhea in this model appears that it cannot exceed 10% no matter how many partners one has. And I don't think that's the most accurate way to model that. So to summarize again, math is critical to this debate, and I think we need to rethink the math in the studies of gonorrhea and kissing. As I showed these 4 main arguments, there's very limited evidence for these assertions, and when we rethink the math in these studies, the weight of evidence in these studies is further diminished. Thank you.
Now, our debaters both will have a chance for their rebuttals. We will begin with Dr. Fairley.
Well, thank you, Harold. That was a fabulous presentation, and I'm just delightful to get people to think so carefully about this particular problem, because in honesty, we don't really know what the answer is, but I'm going to give you some insights into Harold's presentation that might be helpful. So first of all, I want to say we saw each other's main talks beforehand, and that really added to the science of this session. Also, it was tremendous relief because I'm incredibly slow on my feet. I would find it really hard to do this real time. Now, Harold made 4 arguments. The first argument was that we used the wrong denominator. Well, I don't think that's right. If you imagine there are 59 men amongst the 584 men who formed these couples, and you threw a red ball out to those 59 red balls out to those 584 men, then the proportion you expect, the proportion of couples who both got a red ball would be very low. So I don't think the right denominator is 96. I think the right denominator is 584. It's been subject to peer review now for a substantial period of time, and no one has contacted us saying we had the wrong denominator. I'll leave it with you to decide. The second is this issue that saliva as a lubricant for anal sex provides some evidence that gonorrhea might be transmitted through saliva. Well, Harold made the argument that we didn't include people who didn't have any partners or receptive anal sex, but that represented such a tiny proportion of individuals here, only 4%. There was no partners in the last 3 months, not ever, and they actually had quite a high prevalence of gonorrhea, and we didn't use that in the adjusted analysis anyway. But I'm so grateful that he showed me this paper, because in this particular paper, when you try and work out what predicts infection in the throat, true, exposure to the anus doesn't, but guess what? Exposure to oral sex of your partner doesn't, ejaculating in the mouth doesn't, and analingus doesn't. So we can't get it from the penis, we can't get it from the throat. Guess what? There's only one site left. That's the throat. Then there's a claim about 100 partners a year. So the claim being that if partners, that if they had all the high-risk ones with 10, you'd pick up this infection. Well, mixing isn't like that. The R value for mixing between partner numbers in couples is only about 0.26. You'd need 100% transmission probability for that to happen. It's very low. But finally, the incidence in the throat is probably much higher than the 20 that I've estimated. So Harold, you're right. You don't need 100 partners. You need 300. Finally, the model that Lei Zhang wrote, and the argument being that the Spicknell model could explain prevalence data without involving kissing. But the problem with that model that Spicknell did was he assumed a urethral prevalence of 5.1%, which is more than 10 times higher than it actually was. So if lots of penises are infected, of course.
I will provide a rebuttal. Kit gave the example of partner studies in which both men had throat gonorrhea in 26% of the time, in partnerships in which neither man had urethral gonorrhea. And I'm glad he used this illustration, because I want to point out that Mitch and Cam are a married, mutually monogamous couple. Neither man should have gonorrhea at any anatomic site. And I think this highlights one of the main problems in the partner studies in MSM, is they do not account for how the gonorrhea was introduced into the partnership to begin with. And as I showed, I think these partner studies provide evidence against gonorrhea transmission through kissing. I had a feeling that Kit might question the calculation of the probabilities of the partnership. And he's right, if you include all the partners in the study, you do have a much higher probability of concordance than would be expected by chance. For example, the throat concordance is 4.1 times more likely than would be expected by chance. But it's true for all of these. You'd expect concordance if there are factors such as partners being correlated in their seeking of outside partners in the relationship and all these factors. What really matters is that the traditional explanation, rectal to urethral, is a much higher, 10 times higher than would be expected by chance. The study of the music festival was quite interesting. I read this for several hours, and to me it just seemed like a board game Clue that got turned into a sex party, where Colonel Mustard was hooking up with Miss Peacock in the conservatory and Miss Scarlet and Miss White were kissing in the billiard room. And I just could not make much sense of it. So I think the best way to interpret this is that gonorrhea maybe could be transmitted by music festivals. And again, Kit's argument rests on the observation that the prevalence of urethral gonorrhea is too rare to explain the high incidence of oral pharyngeal infection. And again, I think the model that Dr. Spicknall did is quite a good one, and shows, and it's one of the several models that shows that gonorrhea prevalence can indeed be explained without kissing as a route of transmission. As I mentioned earlier, we have an economist going against a world-renowned infectious disease expert, so I thought it would help make it more fair if I recruited some help from another world-renowned expert. So I wanted to borrow from Hunter Hansfield's summary of these issues. He talked about how extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the standard of evidence is insufficient. The clinical experience is not supportive of Kit's hypothesis. For example, where is the epidemic of oral infection in teens and young adults who frequently kiss? The underlying premises, such that urethral infection cannot sustain transmission, is unsupported. Transmission by saliva is unproved. And the published research in support of this proposal, as far as the mathematical modeling goes, it's uncertain, possibly flawed, and the observational research is inconclusive at best. So I think the next steps, I think we need to keep an open mind and try to work together to figure out all we can about gonorrhea transmission and fill in our gaps in the understanding. And gonorrhea transmission may prove one day to be an important route of transmission, but right now there is no evidence for this yet. Thank you.